How's it going, everybody? My name is George Marlow, and I will be presenting the Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne today. All right, let's get into it. Starting with Nathaniel Hawthorne's biography, he was born on July 4th in 1804 and died on May 19th, 1864. He was born in Salem, Massachusetts, and that's where he spent a lot of his time, the initial part of his time growing up. When Nathaniel was 4 years old, his father, who was a ship captain, died in one of his voyages and left his young mother, Nathaniel's mother, to raise him and his two brothers. He was only age 4 when this happened, and so they moved in with one of his mother's affluent brothers. Their name was the Mannings, and so he grew up in their house and in Salem. And their brother lived in Maine. At the Sebago Lake. He attended Boydon College in Brunswick, Maine in 1825, and then soon after graduating in 1842, he married Sophia Peabody, who was a transcendentalist, and they had 3 children together. Her being a transcendentalist had a lot of effect on his later work. Soon after his graduation, he didn't really become much of a distinguished writer. He had met some very important people in his college days, or people that were to become very important. One was to become the president of the United States at one point. But he didn't do much right out of the college. He spent most of his time reading and studying and trying to master literature and just get as much reading as he possibly could. He became a master of allegorical and symbolic tale throughout his years. He is an avid defender of the Puritan orthodoxy, and this is a main point of the Scarlet Letter and a big factor behind the book. The Scarlet Letter and the House of Seven Gables are his 2 biggest works that most people know him by. And so next, I thought we would talk about the main characters briefly before we got into the summary of the book, just to kind of give an overview. Hester Prynne is the main character of the whole book. And she wore the main Scarlet Letter throughout the book. It's what the whole book was based on. And she is the mother of Pearl Prynne, her daughter. Her father was not Hester's actual husband, which we'll get more into later. Then Roger Chillingworth, which isn't his actual name, but is Hester's original husband when they lived in Europe. But even though that isn't his actual name, it's the alias he uses when he arrives to Boston to conceal his identity from the town. And then the final main character is Arthur Dimmesdale. He's the Reverend in Boston during the time whenever Hester moves over, and is a very big public figure. He makes his famous sermons, which people avidly follow and listen to because of his supposed holiness. But we'll find out more about that later. And we will find out where his actual relationship to Penny and Hester is soon. So now into the plot of the Scarlet Letter. So Hester, originally living in Europe, the main character sailed from Europe to Boston without her husband. Her husband was planning on coming later to meet up with her. Hester was married to her husband before she left, and then when she arrived in Boston, she had an affair and gave birth to her daughter, Pearl. And she was sent to jail for this because it was adultery. This is a very Puritan society, and they did not stand for anything like that. She was very lucky that she didn't get killed. The identity of Penny's father was unknown because Hester wouldn't tell anybody. And the reason that Hester wasn't hung because of her adultery was because they considered that, or at least they thought that her actual husband was dead, so they saved her life. Soon after she gets out of jail, she moves to a cabin out in the woods with her daughter, Penny. And eventually the town people talk and get together, and they try to take Penny from her because they see Hester is not fit to raise her. And she is given the letter A, the red letter A on her chest, as once she leaves the jail and right before she moves to the cabin. And the people trying to take Penny away, that happens a few years after her moving to the cabin, just because they think she's not fit to be a mother. And the reason she was able to keep Penny is because Dimmesdale, who is the actual father of Penny, stepped in and gave a speech saying why Hester should be able to keep her daughter, which was very successful, and it swayed the people in the town to let Hester hold on to Penny. Okay, next slide. Then the Reverend Dimsdale becomes sick, and Chillingworth, who is Hester's original husband but under this alias, moves in with Dimsdale. Chillingworth is very suspicious of Dimsdale because of the way he acts around him and around, or how he acts whenever the subject of Hester is brought up. And Chillingworth starts to suspect that Dimsdale is the actual father, and his guilt is and Dimsdale's guilt is the reason for his sickness. Nobody actually knew who the father was at this point, but Chillingworth starting to suspect it. Chillingworth soon discovered a red letter on Dimsdale's chest, which was hidden, but Dimsdale was wearing this as a repentance for his sins of sleeping with Hester. Dimsdale was having a really tough time with the guilt of doing this. It really tore him apart because he was a very holy man, and that adulterous act was not like him. Over years of service to the town, Hester finally starts to gain the respect in their town because she is consistently good to people and hearing them out and trying to help people. She spends a lot of her time helping people, and she also becomes used to wearing the red A and begins to not care about wearing it or caring what people think of her for wearing it. Hester eventually becomes so sick of Chillingworth holding their secret over her and Dimsdale's head that she finally tells Dimsdale the secret that Chillingworth is actually her husband, which Dimsdale takes very poorly. Dimsdale then gets together with Hester and asks her to move away with her. And Hester says that she will go with him to start a new life. So they make a plan to escape the town of Boston. They plan on leaving on a ship in 4 days. But right before they're about to leave, Chillingsworth finds out their plan to escape. So they realize that won't work. And then in shock, Dimsdale actually confesses his relationship to Hester and Pearl in front of the whole town up on their pedestal. And this was during one of his famous sermons, and reveals the red A on his chest to the whole town. And then Pearl, the daughter, proceeds to kiss Dimsdale for his confession. And then right after this confession, Dimsdale dies from his illness on the stage. Soon after that, Chillingworth dies, and this leaves Hester a large inheritance, which she used to move away and to start a new life with her daughter, Penny. Then once Penny grew up, Hester moves back to the town of Boston and moves back into the same cabin that she originally lived in. And she put her red Scarlet A back on because she didn't care about it at that point, and she didn't care about being identified by that. And then a few years later, she dies and is buried right next to Dimsdale, and they share a tombstone with the red letter A on it. So that's the overall plot. Quick little summary of the book. Now into the historical background of this book. So the Hawthorne family was some of the earliest settlers in Massachusetts. It was the Massachusetts Bay Colony originally, and these people were all Puritans. So Hawthorne was immediately thrown into the Puritan way of life when he was born, which I will discuss more later on. But he was born in Salem. This is just a very Puritan community that had very strict and rigid ways of growing up. His grandfather was John Hawthorne, who was one of the judges in the 1692 Salem witch trials. Nathaniel was very interested in this, and it's always fascinated him, but he also felt guilty about his family's, and specifically his grandfather's association with those witch trials because of what happened to those people. Throughout his life, Hawthorne was very fascinated and disturbed by this kinship of his grandfather John, and then he was raised by his widowed mother. Now I'll talk more about the Puritan way of life and how that affected Nathaniel. You can really see this Puritan ideology in their ways of thinking in a lot of his works. He takes this Puritan lifestyle as one of his main subjects, and it's especially prevalent in the Scarlet Letter. These Puritans were just a group of religious reformers who arrived in Massachusetts in the early 1600s, the 1630s to be exact, and they were known for their intolerance of dissenting ideas and lifestyles. The Scarlet Letter uses repressive, authoritarian Puritan society as an analog for humankind in general, and the Puritan setting enables him to portray the human soul under extreme pressures and what happens to people's decisions in a type of scenario like that. And it really is close and resembles the type of society we see in the Scarlet Letter, and you see how those decisions affect people, and then the people, the minds of the society as a whole. Into the major influences, Romanticism had a very big influence in this book. It was published during the height of the Romanticism in literature, and it was published in 1850, right in the middle of this movement. The Scarlet Letter is considered a romance novel, and its original title was actually The Scarlet Letter, a Romance. That was the full title, but they changed it later on. And this Romanticism period, it was a literary movement that represented a rich and diverse group of aesthetically appealing ideas and theories. And this can be seen all throughout the Scarlet Letter. The Puritan religion definitely had a very big impact on this book. The main character, Hester, definitely dissented against the norms of the Puritan society. And it shows what happens to a person when they disobey those Puritan rules and how strict of a life that those people lived, and how there wasn't much acceptance for people messing up. Everyone does mess up at some point, and the Puritans just really took hard to this. Hawthorne's past led him to believe that maybe the Puritan lifestyle is not all it was cracked up to be. He kind of resented the religion in a few ways, when you can kind of see that in the Scarlet Letter, as he points out some of the flaws in their system. That constant forcing of that religion, the Puritan religion, on their children led to his disdain for the religion itself, mainly because it didn't really allow him to choose his own ways and let him do what he wants to do. Just a very rigid lifestyle that they have. And he kind of tested the Puritan ideology and poked some holes in it in this book. You can see it in the Scarlet Letter, when Hester is cast out of her society almost entirely just for making the mistake of sleeping with another man, even though her husband was considered dead at the time. And really, that wouldn't be that big of a mistake today. But back then, it kind of cost her whole life and changed the path of her entire life. Feminism was also a major influence on this book. Hester is alone with her daughter for most of the story. It's kind of the focus of the book. She is also the only grown-up main character that stays alive the longest until the very end, which makes her seem almost stronger and rougher than the men of the story as they die before her. Nathaniel didn't like the typical stay-at-home wife story, from what I've read, and that's why he kind of focused on the men in the family by making it a little different in the Scarlet Letter. And in the end, Hester reaches a social freedom that the other characters were not able to obtain. And that was not normal for women back in the day because they didn't have much control and say in their past, usually. Now we'll go into some main themes in the book. Individualism was the biggest one that I picked out of the story. Individualism basically being the idea of the importance of the individual compared to the larger society. And Hester is obviously the individual here. In the town of Boston is the society. Hester is apart from her whole society as a punishment for her one crime of adultery. Hawthorne succeeded in making Hester a likable character even despite this crime. She was strong and capable and kind and humble. And then in contrast, the town people in the larger group were pretty nasty and unkind. They're really rude to her. And when she even served them, they still looked down on her just because of her past and that red letter A on her chest. And through this depiction, Hawthorne really succeeded in showing the readers that society may not always have it right, and one should rely on one's own reasoning and common sense instead. Sin was also a very big theme that was prevalent throughout the whole book. The whole book was kind of based around sin, with that original sin of adultery that Hester committed. And it just shows, this book shows how sin is not taken lightly by that Puritan ideology. Another very big theme that could be seen throughout most of the book was nature. And I kind of thought that this nature, the reason there was so much nature in the book was that it kind of stood in contrast to Puritanism, the Puritan way. Puritanism in the book kind of represented the merciless and rigid things of life where there wasn't a whole lot of wiggle room, while nature, on the other hand, was forgiving and flexible. This can kind of be seen in the scenes throughout the book. This contrast is made pretty clear from the very first page when the narrator contrasts the black flower of the prison that punishes sin with the red rose that he imagines forgives those sentenced to die. Now I'll move on to some literary devices that I found throughout the book. The biggest one being the symbolism of the Scarlet Letter. I thought it's the meaning of the Scarlet Letter definitely changes throughout the book, and you kind of have to keep up with it. It definitely changes from the beginning to the end of the book. I think Scarlet Letter symbols adultery and sin at the very beginning of the book, and kind of shows how it controls her whole life. And then it starts to represent being able to control oneself and free will at the end of the book, when Hester chooses to put the letter back on when she moves back into her cabin, because she wasn't going to let that ache control her life anymore, and she didn't care what the crowd or the society's thought of her was, but she knew who she was, and she knew what she was going to do. Another literary device I found was foreshadowing. In the very beginning of the book, when Pearl is just a baby, the first time she sees Dimmesdale, she reaches her hand out and towards him and tries to grab him. The reader and even Pearl had no idea that Dimmesdale was a father at this point, but this kind of foreshadowed the information that we were soon to learn. And I thought I had to go back. I remember that when I was reading, I had to go back and confirm that I saw that. But yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting, and I like foreshadowing little things like that. Next is simile, like a black shadow emerging into sunshine. There are many similes throughout the book and many other small literary devices that were scattered all throughout this book. Now we'll go to the meanings that I got out of this book. Transcendentalism, I prefer to say. That's what his wife, Sophia, mainly believed in. And this was a religious and philosophical movement in the early 19th century that said that it was the belief that divinity manifests itself everywhere, particularly in the natural world. And this divinity is in nature, and it is of something that Puritans were not too fond of, as they thought of nature as pure evil. This ideology advocated a personalized and direct relationship with the divine instead of a more strict and structured religion like the Puritan way was. This like transcendental idea is very prevalent in the Scarlet Letter and in the Puritan way. These two ideas fit perfectly into like the main dilemma of the Scarlet Letter, I thought, and I think Nathaniel definitely got a lot of these ideas from his wife. And the overall meaning I took from the book was that we have all committed sins. Even though some are worse than others, we have all done it at some point. The Scarlet Letter is an extremely complex text. It can have a lot of, or at least a wide range of meanings to different audiences. And I kind of felt that the main meaning of the Scarlet Letter was the effect of never-ending sin and how different societies treat certain sins. Nathaniel pushed the boundaries in regards to what he believed in the Puritan ideology in this book and what he thought was nonsense. Obviously, all societies punish sin in some sort of way, but the Puritan punishment was definitely on the harsher end of the spectrum, and Nathaniel shines the light on the effects of this type of punishment can have on the path of one's life, when in the end, every single one of us have committed sins. Now into my evaluation of the book, I thought this was a great book. It was one of the best books that I've read. I thought I really enjoyed how Nathaniel Hawthorne pushed the limits of what is accepted in a Puritan society because he did not completely agree with their ways. This is not an easy thing to do, especially when your entire family and history has only thought one way for so long. The character development was fast enough to keep my attention and gain it very quickly, and I felt some very strong emotions for Hester and Pearl throughout my reading because of Hawthorne's style of writing. I think the ending might not have been the most exciting end to a story that I've ever read, just as it was kind of winding down. But I think that Hester moving back into her cabin and putting that red letter A back on was extremely fitting, considering everything that she had gone through, and I thought it was very powerful. Is this novel literary? Yes, because it shows the beginning of our revolutionary spirit in America. This Puritan ideology, I kind of felt like it contrasted the way that we were trending, especially looking at where we are today. Puritan was very strict, very rigid, very obedient. It'd be very obedient to be in that those type of societies. And then this was going on in the 1600s, and in 1774 we declared independence. It was a rebellion, and we just started to get more and pushing the limits more and more and more. I still think we're pushing the limits today, but I think it's escalated, and I think it kind of comes back from that Puritan way of life. I thought one of the things that makes a novel like The Scarlet Letter a classic is that it illuminates for us Americans what social and cultural behaviors have contributed to our identity. and it kind of shows the path that we've been on, and it kind of makes us interested to see what's going on in the future. It makes us look at the repressive social doctrines that people have gone through, and what it does to people, and it makes you thankful for what you have today. Here is my works cited, and this is in my presentation. Thank you for listening.